Heroism is usually depicted as an attack, cheers of hurrah and waving banners. But the story you are about to hear smells not of victory, but of burnt oil, stale sweat, and primal terror. In October 1942, one crew pulled off something the official reports were too ashamed to mention. They turned their tank into a steel coffin, but forgot to nail down the lid. Imagine sitting inside a machine that looks like a pile of scrap metal to the enemy. Enemy soldiers use your tank as a smoking lounge, leaning their backs against the tracks and laughing, unaware that you are watching them through a gun sight from arm's length away. This is a story about the most brazen and filthy lie of the Second World War, where life depended on a rusty drain pipe and dirty foot wraps. Watch until the end to find out how 4 men managed to cheat death while sitting in the center of the German rear, and why salvation came to them not in the form of angels, but in the form of choice Russian profanity. The Maybach 120 engine choked on its own oil and went silent. It wasn't just silence. It was a vacuum that instantly slammed against the ears. A second later, the nose was hit by the sharp, nauseating smell of burnt mineral lubricant. The machine's black blood gushed onto the red-hot metal of the crankcase. 25 tons of captured Krupp steel, which just a minute ago had been a formidable weapon, turned into real estate in the middle of no man's land. October 1942, northern part of Stalingrad, the Berekadi factory district. Here, time was measured not in minutes, but in calibers. And right now, for the crew, it had stopped. Sergeant Major Gromov didn't scream. In this steel coffin, where they had forgotten to nail the lid, screaming was a waste of oxygen. He simply looked at the dashboard, where the needles for temperature and oil pressure had dropped into the dead zone. The crankcase was punctured. A connecting rod had likely turned the engine's guts into metal mush. The tank's muscles had atrophied, leaving only a skeleton of armor. Through the vision block, the gray haze of October twilight seeped in, mixed with the concrete dust of destroyed workshops. Outside, just 70 meters away, lay the German infantry. Behind them, about 200 meters away, lay our anti-tank gunners. For both sides, this silhouette with the characteristic muzzle brake of a long-barreled 75mm gun was a target. Their own side would strike, mistaking them for a counter-attacking enemy. The others would finish them off to prevent the equipment from being recovered.
"We've arrived."
The driver's voice sounded hollow, as if coming from underground. "Oil's gone. Engine's done. Seized up." "Belay the panic." Gromov's whisper was dry, like the crackle of static electricity. "Do not open the hatches. Sit tight." Cold began to accumulate inside the fighting compartment. The cooling armor, deprived of the running motor's heat, instantly sucked the degrees out of the air. This cold was tangible. It crept under the oil-stained padded jackets, touched sweaty backs, forcing muscles to contract in uncontrollable shivering. But scarier than the cold was the sound, or rather, its absence. Silence after a battle in Stalingrad is always a harbinger of trouble. One could hear the metal of the exhaust manifolds cooling down. Ting, ting. Each such click felt like a sledgehammer blow to exposed nerves. The crew froze. Right now, they weren't people, but functional appendages of a dying mechanism. The gunner pressed himself against the forehead pad of the Zeiss sight, whose coated optics, the pride of German engineering, now served a Soviet eye. His hands, accustomed to the traversing hand wheels, lay on his knees, but his fingers continued to tremble, repeating phantom movements. The loader sat on the ammo rack, hugging the breech block to his chest, as if trying to warm himself on the gun's residual heat. In the enclosed volume of the Panzer IV, which was much more spacious than our T-34s, it now felt as cramped as a grave. The air thickened, filling with the scent of burning, old rags and unwashed bodies. "Comrade Sergeant Major." The gunner didn't look up from the eyepiece. "Movement at 2 o'clock. Landmark is the pile of bricks by the 3rd workshop. Looks like a machine gun crew." "Don't twitch." Gromov moved to the commander's cupola, trying not to kick the shell casing catcher. Any clanking of metal now was equivalent to suicide. The situation was a stalemate from a tactical point of view. To leave the machine meant catching a burst in the back from a German MG or catching a mortar shard. To stay meant waiting until the Germans brought up a PaK-40 anti-tank gun or simply burned the immobile tank with a thermite charge. The ruins of the Barricadi factory resembled a layer cake, where floors and basements changed hands 3 times a day. It was a labyrinth of death, and their tank was stuck in the very center of this labyrinth. Gromov assessed the situation with the pragmatism of a man who had already written himself off, but hadn't yet filed the paperwork. The German Panzer IV, modification F2, was a complex machine. Excellent optics, soft suspension, electric gun trigger, but without an engine, it was just 25 tons of quality steel. However, the steel still stopped bullets, and the gun could still shoot.
"Listen to my command."
Gromov spoke with just his lips, but in the absolute silence, every word cut into the crew's consciousness.
"We aren't driving. We are now a pillbox, a stationary firing point. Armor intact? Intact. We have shells? 18 rounds. 6 armor-piercing, 12 high-explosive," replied the loader, who remembered the ammo rack by touch. "Then we fight, but by our own rules."
He understood that standard combat was over for them. A game of hide-and-seek with death had begun. If the Germans realized the crew was alive, they would be destroyed in 5 minutes. If our guys saw the silhouette of a German tank turning its turret toward them, regimental artillery would cover them. They needed to become invisible, to dissolve into this chaos of broken brick and twisted rebar, to make the square German turret become part of the landscape, a pile of garbage that no one pays attention to. It was getting dark in the vision block. Night was descending on Stalingrad, bringing with it not relief, but a change in hunting rules. Daytime optics went blind. The time of hearing and intuition was arriving. Gromov ran his palm over the cold breech of the gun. The metal was slippery with condensation. The tank was dying as a vehicle, but had to be resurrected as an ambush. "What about ventilation?" the commander asked. "Electric isn't working. Batteries will die in an hour if we run it," the driver answered. "We'll suffocate from the fumes after the second shot."
"That means we shoot rarely,"
Gromov cut him off. "And only for sure. But right now, we need to disappear." He looked at the rags lying underfoot, then shifted his gaze to a ventilation pipe torn off by an explosion, sticking out of a pile of debris outside, right by the track. A plan began to form in the sergeant major's mind, accustomed to solving equations of survival. A plan that was brazen, technically dirty, but the only one possible. War is not parades. War is the skill of using trash to kill the enemy before he realizes you are still alive. Gromov looked up at the crew. In their eyes, he read the animal fear of trapped beasts. This fear needed to be channeled into work, into heavy, dirty physical work that would push out thoughts of death. "Get the tools," he commanded. "Get the rags and grease ready. We're going to change our appearance. The tank has to die make-believe, so we can survive for real." The sergeant major's gaze fell on a piece of tin from a torn fender and a coil of wire. It was too little for repair, but enough for a masquerade. The tin creaked. In the viscous silence of the neutral strip, this sound seemed like a cannon shot. Gromov instantly covered the loader's hands, which were gripping the wire cutters, with his palm. Both froze, turning into pure hearing. Outside, somewhere to the left, a helmet clinked against a brick. But no shooting followed. The Germans were tired too. Their vigilance had been dulled by the routine of positional warfare. The sergeant major slowly removed his hand and nodded at the gun barrel. The order was understood without words. Do it, but don't make noise. The task was engineering-based and absolutely suicidal. To change the geometry of Vehicle 25 so that even through Zeiss binoculars, it looked not like a combat unit, but like a pile of scrap metal. Gromov understood. Just throwing branches on top wasn't enough. The silhouette of a T4 with its right angles and characteristic gun mantlet was recognizable to any Wehrmacht infantryman on a reflex level. They needed to break this silhouette, distort it, turn a predator into carrion. The mechanic driver, tearing the skin on his knuckles, unscrewed the mountings of the side skirts. Those that still held on needed to be skewed, creating the appearance of an ammo detonation in the fender storage. But the main element of camouflage became that very ventilation pipe. Rusty, dented, torn from the wall of a factory workshop by an explosion. The three of them, gasping from the strain and trying not to bang the metal against the armor, fitted this 3-meter galvanized casing right onto the gun barrel. "Careful with the muzzle brake," whispered the gunner as the jagged edge of the pipe scraped against the steel of the barrel. "If we damage the chamber, the barrel will blow when we shoot." "Pull," exhaled Gromov, ignoring the warning. "If we're discovered, we won't need the barrel anyway." The pipe fit tightly, hiding the predatory profile of the German long-barreled gun. Now sticking out of the turret was not a KWK-40 barrel, but some ridiculous broken stump of communications equipment, staring pointlessly into the sky. It was farm boy tuning at the cost of life. Crude work, insulting to precise German engineering. But it was precisely this crudeness that gave them a chance now. Inside the tank, other work was going on. War is primarily sound. The clang of a hatch is a death sentence. The click of a bolt is an invitation for a grenadier. Gromov ordered all the rags in the tank to be put to use. Oily rags, spare foot wraps, even the lining from the commander's padded jacket went into action. The crew methodically wrapped every handle, every lever, every contact edge of the hatches. Steel must not touch steel. The loader, working in total darkness, by touch, laid layers of dirty fabric into the openings of the turret hatches. Now, if they had to be opened for ventilation or observation, they would move softly, without that treacherous metallic ring. Hands slipped from oil and sweat. The heavy smell of unwashed bodies and technical fluid hung in the stale air, but no one winced. The sense of smell had dulled, giving way to the sense of touch. Fingers saw burrs on the metal better than eyes. The most difficult task was the turret ring. Without the engine, the hydraulics and electric traverse drive were dead. Rotating the turret manually, using hand wheels, was back-breaking labor, accompanied by the characteristic howl of gears. This howl in the night silence would be heard for 100 meters. "It's dry, damn it," croaked the gunner, trying to turn the wheel. "It squeaks." "Oil," Gromov said shortly. There was nowhere to get oil except from the tank itself. The mechanic driver, wriggling like a snake on the floor of the fighting compartment, reached the transmission hatch. He scooped up the remains of the thick, stinking sludge by the handful, right with his palms, and passed this black lubricant up. The crew rubbed the oil into the teeth of the turret ring, like ointment into aching joints. They lubricated the mechanism generously, sparing neither strength nor clothes. Gromov personally went over the guides with an oily rag. "Try it," he commanded in a whisper. The gunner leaned on the handwheel, The turret moved heavily, reluctantly, but it moved. The sound changed. Instead of a dry metallic screech, there was only the dull, satisfied squelching of thick grease. "It's moving," exhaled the gunner. "Heavy, but quiet." Gromov wiped his hands on his pants, leaving black, greasy stripes on the fabric. Now they were ready. Outside, the tank looked like a dead heap of junk, but inside, it had turned into a mechanism running on muscle power and fear. The engineering audacity was complete. The crew sat in the dark, dirty, wet with sweat, with faces black from oil. They had done everything they could. Now, all that remained was to wait. Suddenly, the hands of the clock, which seemed frozen, moved.
From behind the wall of the destroyed workshop, where their dead zone ended, came the rhythmic crunch of gravel. These were not single footsteps. A group was walking. The sound of boots hobnailed with steel nails is unmistakable. Gromov slowly raised his hand, calling for absolute silence, although no one in the tank was breathing anyway. The German quality, which they had just diligently disfigured on the outside, now had to pass a durability test from the inside. The steps were approaching. Someone was walking straight toward their steel grave. Midnight came not with a change of lighting, but with a change in air density. The darkness outside became tangible, heavy as lead, but the silence the crew had so carefully guarded was torn apart. Right on course, just 5 meters from the frontal armor, gravel crunched. The sound of hobnailed German boots, that rhythmic, hard clatter of metal on stone, was louder than an artillery cannonade. These weren't scouts sneaking in the shadows. It was infantry walking. Walking confidently, like they owned the place. Not crouching, knowing there were no Russians in this sector. Gromov pressed against the vision slit of the commander's cupola. The glass of the vision block, cloudy from condensation and time, caught only fragments of reality. The hems of greatcoats, the glint of a helmet, the barrel of a carbine. There were 7 of them. A squad of grenadiers returning from the front line or moving out to a night post. They stopped right by the side of the machine. Inside the tank, time compressed into a tight spring. The air, already stale, seemed to stop entering their lungs. 4 Soviet tankers froze, turning into pure hearing. Now their lives depended not on the thickness of the armor, but on the psychology of perception. For a German soldier, the silhouette of a number 4 was a symbol of safety, familiar geometry, part of their iron order. The angular turret, the characteristic gun mantlet, all this screamed friendly. But this friendly was mutilated. The pipe on the barrel, rags on the hatches, unnaturally frozen road wheels. The tank looked like a corpse forgotten on the battlefield. One of the Germans walked right up close. Gromov heard a lighter strike. A faint reflection of the flame illuminated the tank's interior for a second through a microscopic slit in the armored cover of the observation device. The German was lighting a cigarette, leaning his back against the track of their tank. He was leaning against death, but didn't know it. "Schrott!" came a muffled voice from outside. Scrap metal. "Ja, ja," answered another voice. "Kaputt!" This word, kaputt, sounded like a pardon. They bought it. For them, it was just a pile of iron, war scenery. But the crew's nerves were stretched to the limit of steel's tensile strength. The gunner, sitting at the bow MG-34 machine gun, couldn't take it. His hands, resting on the firing handles, twitched. His finger lay on the trigger. It was a reflex, an animal instinct to destroy a threat that is at arm's length. Gromov felt this movement not with his eyes, but with his skin. In the cramped space of the fighting compartment,
The electricity of panic transmits instantly. If the gunner squeezed the trigger, the MG would spit a burst at point-blank range. They would drop 2, maybe 3, but the rest would pelt the stationary tank with grenades or burn it with a flamethrower in a second. It wouldn't be a battle. It would be an execution. The sergeant major couldn't shout, couldn't even whisper. He made the only possible move. His heavy, calloused hand landed on the gunner's shoulder in an iron grip. His fingers dug into the fabric of the tunic, reaching living flesh, causing pain. It wasn't a friendly gesture, but a command gesture, a vice gesture. Gromov pressed down, forcing the soldier into the seat, blocking the very possibility of movement. The gunner jerked, sucked in air noisily through his nose. His eyes widened in the dark, meeting the heavy, unblinking gaze of the commander. In this silent duel inside the tank, the fate of the crew was being decided. Gromov held him, feeling someone else's heart pounding under his palm. The beats were frequent, ragged, like the work of an overheated engine. "Wait," said this grip. "Endure." Killing must be done with a cool head, not trembling hands. Right now, heroism lay not in opening fire, but in letting the enemy walk away alive. Outside, someone laughed. The sound of laughter seemed sacrilegious. The German pushed off the armor, boots crunching on the stones again. "Komm!" commanded a voice. "Weiter!" The steps began to recede, first loud, then quieter, dissolving into the noise of the night wind wandering through the factory ruins. Gromov slowly unclenched his fingers. There would surely be bruises on the gunner's shoulder. The guy dropped his head onto his hands, his shoulders shaking in a soundless cough. The adrenaline that had poisoned his blood was leaving him. "Belay the hysterics." Gromov's whisper was barely audible, but the metal was back in his voice. "We made it." "I thought they were going to open the hatch," exhaled the loader, sitting in the corner whiter than chalk. "Thinking is harmful. Listen to commands." The sergeant major cut him off. They passed the endurance test. The tank became friendly to the enemies. The German form worked better than any armor. Now they were infiltrators, a foreign body in the organism of the German defense. They were inside the perimeter, behind the backs of the forward patrols. This gave a unique tactical advantage, but also imposed a terrible responsibility. Any mistake, any extra sound now meant not just detection, but instant death. Gromov pressed against the optics again. His eyes had adjusted to the darkness. Now that the fear had receded, giving way to cold calculation, he saw not just ruins. He saw a sector of fire. The tank was positioned perfectly. The Germans who walked by, without knowing it, confirmed the quality of the camouflage. Night was taking its rights, and somewhere far away, from the direction of the Volga, a rumble began to grow. The night artillery preparation was beginning. The ground under the tracks vibrated slightly. "Hear that?" Gromov turned his head to the crew. "The music is playing. Our entrance is coming up." The rumble of explosions was becoming rhythmic. It wasn't chaotic firing, but the methodical work of heavy artillery by grid squares. For the infantry, it was hell. For Gromov, it was a metronome. Perfect cover for someone who wants to shoot and remain invisible. The lie about the dead machine was over. The truth of war was beginning. Ballistics synchronized with someone else's death. The ground under the tracks wasn't just trembling. It was breathing in time with the explosions. A German battery of 150mm howitzers, located somewhere in the rear, was methodically plowing up square G7, trying to smoke out Soviet infantry from the ruins of the mechanical workshop. For any soldier on the front line, this sound was a messenger of death. But for Sergeant Major Gromov, it became the rhythm of life. It was a syncopation of war, a complex musical time signature into which he had to wedge his note so that no one noticed the false one. Gromov sat clutching the commander's hatch and counted. His lips moved soundlessly. 21, 22, 23. Whistle. Impact. Pause. Reloading at the battery. Whistle again. The interval between volleys of heavy guns was about 40 seconds. Mortar barrages wedged in between them, more frequent, sharp, sounding like dogs barking. This cacophony needed to be broken down into components, the loudest instrument identified and adapted to. A tactic Gromov called the pianist in his mind. You need to hit the key exactly at the moment the orchestra hits fortissimo. Landmark 4, Administration Building Basement, Machine Gun Nest. The sergeant major's voice was dry, devoid of emotion. He was dictating the terms of the problem. Distance 200 meters. High explosive. The gunner, hunched over the sight, turned the hand wheels. His movements were smooth, almost gentle, in complete contradiction to the fury raging outside. The Zeiss optics, coated, perfectly calibrated, picked out a narrow embrasure in the dark, from which tracers of a German MG-42 periodically flew out. This machine gun held a whole platoon of our guys under crossfire, not letting them raise their heads. It was a problem, and this problem had to be solved with one shot. This steel coffin wouldn't give them a second chance.
Ready, exhaled the gunner. Wait, Gromov raised his hand.
Inside the tank, tension hung thick as water at depth. The loader froze with the shell case in his hands, afraid to clink the base against the breech block. Now they were playing roulette with the physics of sound. The shot of a 75mm KWK-40 gun is a sharp, whipping crack heard for kilometers. Even in the general noise of battle, an experienced listener will distinguish a tank shot from a mortar explosion. Different tonality, different duration of the sound wave. The only way to fool the enemy's ears was to merge their shot with the close explosion of a heavy shell. The sound wave from the explosion of 100 kilograms of TNT would absorb, devour the sound of the cannon shot, like an ocean wave absorbs the splash of a thrown stone.
Attention!
Gromov listened to the sky. A growing howl, low, vibrating.
A suitcase was flying in. A 120mm mortar shell or a howitzer shell. The sound approached, filling the entire space, pressing on the eardrums, causing an instinctive desire to curl into a ball. But shrinking was not allowed. They had to act at the peak of fear.
"Fire!" Gromov shouted a split second before the expected explosion. The gunner stomped on the firing pedal. The tank jerked. 25 tons of steel rocked on the suspension. The recoil of the barrel inside the turret was short and brutal. The breech jumped back, ejecting a smoking casing. And at that exact moment, exactly at that second, outside, 30 meters from the tank, a heavy German shell exploded. Two monstrous sounds merged into one. The roar of the explosion drowned out the crack of the shot. Outside, it looked like chaos. The earth heaved up in a fountain of fire and rubble.
None of the German infantrymen lying in the trenches nearby noticed that a sheaf of fire had erupted from the pile of garbage that was once a tank. That same rusty ventilation pipe jammed onto the barrel acted as a flash hider and diffuser. It broke up the muzzle flash, mixed it with the reflections of the nearby explosion, and hid the geometry of death. Inside the tank, hell ensued. The ventilation couldn't be turned on. The noise of the electric motor would give away the position instantly. Gunpowder gases, dense and acrid, filled the fighting compartment. The crew coughed, covering their mouths with their sleeves. Their eyes watered. A sour metallic taste of burnt gunpowder appeared in their mouths. This was the price of invisibility.
They were poisoning themselves to kill the enemy. Gromov, ignoring the stinging in his eyes, pressed against the optics. Hit confirmed. Where a second ago a German machine gun had been stuttering, a black hole now gaped. The high-explosive shell, fired with jeweler's precision, flew straight into the embrasure and exploded inside the basement. The brickwork collapsed, burying the crew underneath. The machine gun fell silent. Panic began outside. The Germans, stunned and disorientated, didn't understand what had happened. They saw the explosion of their own shell near the position, saw the destroyed machine gun. Logic suggested the only option: friendly fire. A spotter's error, a stray shell. No one looked at the dead tank. Everyone looked at the sky and toward their own rear lines, sending curses at the artillerymen. -1, Gromov stated, wiping his watering eyes with a dirty rag. Ventilate through the shell ejection port. Quietly. We have 17 shells left. He looked at his watch. Only 5 minutes of the artillery preparation had passed. The concert continued. The enemy's artillery was working for them, supplying free camouflage for every shot. The mathematics of war was simple. While the thunder rumbles, the lightning isn't heard. The tank froze again, turning into a pile of cold metal, waiting for the next crescendo in this symphony of destruction. Inside, the crew greedily gulped the air seeping through microscopic cracks, preparing for the next measure. Their heartbeats gradually synchronized with the explosions outside. Fear was gone. Only work remained. Heavy, dirty work of turning living enemies into dead ones, using their own strength against them. The smoke from the shot didn't dissipate. In the enclosed volume of the fighting compartment, hermetically sealed for the sake of sonic camouflage, the powder gases behaved like a living, hostile creature. In heavy, bluish clouds, they settled to the bottom, filling the space from the floor to the turret ring. The fan was dead. Turning on the forced extraction meant giving themselves away with the whir of the electric motor, audible in the night silence for tens of meters. The crew found themselves trapped in a gas chamber, the key to which lay outside, in the pocket of the German infantry. Now, their main enemy was chemistry. The concentration of carbon monoxide grew with every minute. A sweetish, nauseating taste stood in their mouths, a sure sign that the blood was beginning to lose its ability to carry oxygen. Heads grew heavy with lead, temples were squeezed by an invisible hoop. But opening the hatches was forbidden. Gromov knew this grim arithmetic. It is better to suffocate and live than to breathe deeply and catch a burst of fire. "Remaining 17, croaked the loader. His voice sounded like his throat was stuffed with broken glass. The loader's work in a German number 4 had turned into blind surgery. The ammo racks were in darkness. No backlighting, no flashlights. Only muscle memory and tactile sensitivity, heightened to the limit by hypoxia. The shells lay in niches, cold, heavy cylinders of death. A mistake in choosing the type of ammunition now would cost the lives of the entire crew. To hit infantry with an armor-piercing round was a useless waste of precious metal. To hit a wall with a high-explosive round was a risk of not penetrating the cover. The loader reached into the darkness. His fingers, skinned bloody against metal edges, slid over the casing. 75 millimeters of German quality. He felt the head of the shell like a blind sculptor studying his creation. Sharp, smooth ballistic cap. That's an armor-piercing, a slug. Its job is to break through steel and brick. Blunt, with a screwed-in fuse, rough to the touch. That's high explosive. Sprenggranat. Its job is to sow shrapnel and panic. High explosive, 11. Armor-piercing, 6, he reported, sorting death by touch. Every movement was difficult. In the stale air, muscles soured, movements became cottony. The loader pulled a heavy unitary cartridge from the rack. The weight of the shell seemed excessive, as if gravity inside the tank had doubled. He pressed the cold metal of the casing to his burning face, trying to cool his skin at least a little. Sweat flooded his eyes, corroding the mucous membrane, but there was nothing to wipe it with. The tunic sleeves had long been soaked in oil and soot. Gromov sat motionless, conserving oxygen. His body went into hibernation mode, maintaining only the functions of observation and decision-making. He felt a vein pulsing in his neck. His heart was working at its limit, trying to pump thick blood poisoned by gases. It was a strange state. The body weakened, filling with leaden fatigue, but the brain, under the influence of a hellish cocktail of adrenaline and carbon monoxide, worked with crystal clarity. His hearing became pathologically sharp. He heard the loader scrape a fingernail against the brass of the casing, heard the wheezing breathing of the mechanic driver below, heard the gun breech cooling down, emitting quiet, pitiful clicks. "Breathe through rags," commanded Gromov. "Shallow and rarely, like underwater." They pressed dirty rags to their faces. It helped little against carbon monoxide, but it filtered at least the soot. The crew turned into a single organism fighting for a breath of air. Sensory tension reached a peak. In the darkness, the boundaries of the tank disappeared. The very concept of time disappeared. Only the endless night remained, the smell of oxidized copper from the casings and the taste of their own blood on their lips. The limited ammunition dictated a cruel tactic. 17 shots. 17 opportunities to change the balance of power. Every shell was now personalized. One could not shoot in the direction. One had to shoot at a specific point, at a specific problem. War had turned into accounting, where the debits were German lives, and the credits were the kilograms of explosives remaining in the rack. Suddenly, the gunner jerked, hitting his headset against the sight. "Movement spotted. Officers!" Gromov slowly, trying not to take sharp breaths, pressed against the optics. Oxygen starvation caused colored circles before his eyes, but the target emerged through them. The crew's resources were running low, but the tank's resources were not yet exhausted. The weapon demanded blood to justify the suffering of those trapped inside. Survival is the ability to endure the unbearable longer than your opponent. And right now, in this poisonous darkness, they were enduring. They waited for the enemy to make a mistake, the price of which would equal one high-explosive shell. 4 hours of absolute immobility had turned the tank into an element of the landscape. The human eye is designed so that it stops noticing objects that do not change their position and do not make sounds. For the German observers, whose periscopes scanned the neutral strip, the mutilated Panzer IV had become as familiar a background as the broken brick wall of the workshop or the skeleton of a burnt tram. Gromov's crew had merged with the ruins. They had passed the point of no return, when fear is replaced by icy professional indifference. Only the mathematics of ballistics and the geometry of the firing angle remained. In the eyepiece of the sight, through the grid of the rangefinder scale, the world looked clear and understandable. The German Zeiss optics knew no fatigue. Lenses of flawless quality collected the meager light of the moon and the glow of fires, painting Gromov a picture of the enemy rear. Distance: 150 meters. For a tank gun, this is a point-blank shot, a distance of dagger fire, at which it is technically impossible to miss. In the crosshairs, 3 figures froze. Long greatcoats with popped collars, peaked caps with high crowns, the characteristic gesticulation of people in power. Officers. They felt safe. Gromov saw one of them unfold a map, illuminating it with a flashlight hidden in his sleeve. The white spot of paper became the perfect aiming point. They were discussing the assault, planning tomorrow's attack, assigning men, unsuspecting that their death was in a straight line from them, hidden in a pile of rusty iron. "High explosive," the sergeant major's whisper was barely audible, but in the silence of the tank, it sounded like a sentence. The loader, whose movements had become slow from the carbon monoxide, as if underwater, rammed the shell into the breech. The bolt clanged, locking 700 grams of explosives in the barrel channel. This sound drowned in the thick walls of the turret. Gromov didn't wait for the artillery preparation. Now, when the target was so fat, the risk was justified. He guided the crosshairs just below the map, at the legs of the central figure, where the shell burst would give the maximum spread of shrapnel. The shot tore apart the night silence, but it was a wrong shot. The homemade shroud from the ventilation pipe, put on the barrel, worked as a suppressor and flash hider simultaneously. The flash didn't burst out in a blinding ball, but splashed inside the pipe, partially going into the ground. The sound turned out dull, smeared, devoid of the characteristic tank clang. To the Germans, it sounded like the close explosion of a stray mortar round. In the eyepiece, Gromov saw the result instantly. Where 3 people had stood a second ago, a black-crimson flower of an explosion bloomed. The map was blown into confetti. The officers were swept away by the shockwave and stuffed with steel fragments of the shell casing. No one fell. They were simply thrown, like broken dolls, in different directions.
"Done. Observing panic," Gromov stated, not looking up from the sight.
Chaos began outside. German soldiers nearby fell to the ground, covering their heads with their hands. Shouts of "Medic!" mixed with disorderly firing. They fired into the darkness, toward the Russian positions, at the upper floors of ruins, assuming snipers or mortar spotters were working. No one looked at the dead tank. No one could believe that death had flown from a pile of garbage they had been walking past all night. Psychology worked for the crew. The dead don't shoot. Landmark 8, machine gun nest. Working on the flashes. Gromov switched attention to a new target. Now that the officer command link was knocked out, the German defense in the sector lost coherence. Gromov took advantage of this coldly and methodically. Over the next 2 hours, the crew turned their immobility into an absolute weapon. They didn't fuss. They waited until another MG-42 machine gun crew revealed themselves with a long burst and snuffed it out with one precise shot. Each shot was a risk, but each time the tank's muteness saved them. The echo in the labyrinth of ruins deceived the enemy's hearing. The sound bounced off concrete walls, changed direction, and the Germans couldn't pinpoint the source. They wrote off the losses to the work of Russian regimental artillery, to night U-2 bombers, to anything but the truth. By 4 in the morning, the crew had destroyed 3 machine gun points and a staff group. The 18 shells were melting away. Only 5 were left. Inside the tank, there was nothing to breathe. Eyes were corroded by sweat and gases, but the fatigue was gone. In its place came a grim satisfaction. Gromov understood. They had inflicted more damage on the enemy than if they had gone into a heroic frontal attack and burned in 3 minutes. It was a victory of statics over dynamics, a victory of engineering cunning over brute force. "Don't sleep," Gromov nudged Loader. "Dawn is coming soon. The most dangerous time." The night was ending. The saving darkness, hiding their ugly camouflage, began to turn gray. With the sunrise, the visual contact distance would shrink, and then any little thing, the glint of optics, a wisp of smoke from the barrel, an unnatural shadow, could give them away. The hunt for officers was over. The time of survival under the scrutiny of morning light was beginning. The sergeant major felt the tension, which had let go during the shooting, squeeze his throat again with an icy hand. The ghost games were coming to an end. Reality was preparing to strike back. The gray dawn seeped through the vision slits, killing the saving magic of the night. The morning mist hanging over the ruins of the barricade factory was deceptive. It didn't hide, but merely blurred the outlines, turning every stone into a suspicious shadow. For the crew, the most critical moment had arrived, the transition from auditory control to visual. The camouflage of rags and mud, which worked perfectly in the dark, could reveal their imperfection in daylight. The rusty pipe on the barrel now looked exactly like what it was, a foreign piece of iron stuck onto a combat vehicle. Gromov didn't tear himself away from the vision block of the commander's cupola. His eyes, inflamed from insomnia and powder gases, fixed on movement in the sector. It wasn't an attack. It was the routine of war, which is scarier than any assault. A group of German infantrymen, chilled to the bone overnight, was looking for shelter from the piercing wind blowing from the Volga. And they found the perfect wall, the side of Vehicle 25. The tank rocked slightly.
It wasn't the impact of a shell, but a soft, almost intimate push. A human body leaned against the armor. Gromov froze. The distance between him and the enemy had shrunk to the thickness of a steel sheet, 30 millimeters of side turret armor. He heard not just steps, he heard breathing, the rustle of greatcoat cloth against metal, the clinking of gear. "Hans, hast du Feuer?" The voice sounded so close, as if the German was sitting inside the tank. "Got a light?" A knock of a rifle butt on the hatch. Knock, knock, knock. A persistent, familiar knock. The German soldier was knocking on the turret like one knocks on a neighbor's door asking for salt. He was sure that inside was either emptiness or his own guys, sleeping the sleep of the dead after night duty. The mundanity of the situation was monstrous. The enemy was using their combat vehicle as a smoking lounge, as a fence, as furniture. Gromov slowly, centimeter by centimeter, turned his head to the gunner. The man sat white as a sheet, gripping the handle of his TT pistol so hard his knuckles turned white. If the German decided to look inside, to check why no one answered, it was the end. The hatch wasn't locked tight from the inside, just pulled shut. If the soldier outside pressed the handle, he would see 4 pairs of eyes in Soviet tank helmets. The sergeant major pressed against the vision slit of the pistol port in the rear of the turret. In the narrow field of view, he saw a back in a mouse-gray greatcoat. The German stood relaxed, leaning his carbine against the track, patting his pockets in search of matches. He was the master of the situation. He was a living, warm, confident human being who just wanted to smoke. And the crew inside were cornered rats in an iron barrel. Gromov made a decision instantly. The logic of survival dictated, passivity now equals death. If they didn't answer, the Germans would get curious. If they answered, their accent would give them away. There remained a third option: to answer in a language that requires no translation. The language of TNT. The sergeant major's hand slipped to the pouch on his belt. His fingers found the ribbed, cast-iron body of an F1 grenade. A pineapple. 600 grams of weight, 60 grams of explosive, lethal radius of fragments, 200 meters. In the enclosed space of the courtyard, it would be a meat grinder. Gromov signaled with his eyes to the loader at the rear turret hatch. The man, understanding the plan, nodded. His task was to open the port without sound. That very grease they had rubbed in at night now had to save their lives. The loader, biting his lip until it bled, grabbed the locking handle. The metal was slippery.
Slowly, overcoming the trembling in his hands, he began to turn the mechanism. Outside, they knocked again, more insistently. "Hey, Kameraden! Schlafen Sie! You sleeping?" The hatch lock yielded without a squeak. The small round door, intended for ejecting spent casings and firing personal weapons, opened slightly, forming a gap a palm's width wide. Cold morning air and the smell of cheap ersatz tobacco wafted inside. Gromov straightened the safety pin ends. The ring popped out of the fuse with a ringing metallic click. In the silence of the tank, this sound seemed like thunder. But outside, it was drowned out by the wind and the Germans mumbling. The sergeant major released the safety lever. The pop of the percussion cap rang out. Now he had exactly 4 seconds. 1. 2. He didn't throw the grenade far. He simply unclenched his fingers and let the ribbed cylinder slip into the open hatch, right under the feet of the smokers. 3. The loader instantly slammed the port and threw his whole body against it, pressing the latches. "Get down!" roared Gromov, dropping to the floor of the fighting compartment, dragging the gunner with him. 4. The explosion outside felt not like a sound, but like the blow of a giant hammer against the tank's hull. 25 tons of steel shuddered. Shrapnel from the cast-iron jacket of the grenade drummed against the armor like hail. But scarier were the sounds that followed the explosion. Screams. Inhuman, gurgling screams of the wounded who didn't understand what had happened. A second ago they stood by a safe wall asking for a light, and the wall gave them that fire, tearing their bodies to shreds. The camouflage was blown. The silence, which had been their only ally for the last 12 hours, died. Now the tank ceased to be a ghost. It declared itself loudly, violently, and irreversibly. "Battle stations!" Gromov's voice covered the moans outside. "Start it up! To hell with the batteries! To hell with stealth! Turret left! High explosive!" The illusion was over. The war had begun. The Germans, those who survived the grenade explosion and those in the neighboring ruins, finally realized the terrible truth. The tank in the middle of no man's land is not dead. It is possessed. And now this possessed mechanism was preparing to sell its life at the highest possible exchange rate. The air inside filled with a new smell, not mustiness and oil, but the sharp, electric scent of adrenaline before the last stand. The silence they had so carefully kept for 14 hours burst like an abscess. In response to the grenade explosion, the space around the tank boiled over. It was no longer a duel of snipers or a ghost hunt. It was a slaughter in a phone booth. The Germans, recovering from the initial shock, realized inside the dead machine sit live Russians. And now their goal was not to capture, but to destroy, at any cost. 25 tons of German steel turned into a giant bell being beaten with sledgehammers from all sides. Bursts from MG-42 machine guns lashed the armor with such density that a continuous, vibrating hum stood inside. This sound wasn't heard with ears. It was felt with teeth, skull bones, the diaphragm. The ringing was such that it seemed eardrums were about to burst, letting blood out. "Turret! Turn the turret!" yelled Gromov, but his voice drowned in this acoustic hell. The gunner leaned on the handwheel of the traverse mechanism, but physics cannot be cheated. Without the engine running, without hydraulic assist, rotating the turret manually was excruciatingly slow. The gears, lubricated with dirty oil, howled. The gun barrel crawled to the right at a snail's pace, degree by degree, second by second. But the German infantry outside moved fast. They were everywhere. Tracer bullets hit that very ventilation pipe that had served as their mask all night. The tin couldn't hold. With a screech and grind, the twisted piece of metal was torn off the barrel. The masquerade was over. Now the IV stood naked, bearing its long barrel into the void, while enemies ran in the dead zone right by the tracks, where the cannon simply couldn't depress. "They're under the sides!" The mechanic driver, the only one who saw the lower sector through his observation device, pressed into his seat. "Prepping grenades!" The tank ceased to be a fortress. It became a trap. The armor protected from bullets, but it also prevented seeing the threat. The Germans, taking advantage of the crew's blindness, got right up close. Gromov heard heavy, hobnailed boots clattering on the fenders. The enemy was climbing onto the armor like ants on a beetle. "Hatches! Fire personal weapons!" the sergeant major commanded. It was a gesture of desperation. To open a hatch in battle meant inviting death inside, but there was no other way out. If the Germans planted a charge on the engine compartment or shoved a bundle of grenades under the turret, it would all end instantly. Gromov and the loader simultaneously unlatched the turret hatches. The hatches lifted just a palm's width, enough to stick a barrel out, but too little for a grenade to fly in. The loader stuck the shroud of his PPSH into the gap. A short burst. Outside, someone cried out and rolled down the armor. Gromov fired from his TT through the commander's cupola, shooting almost blindly, orienting by the shadows flickering in the vision blocks. Shooting inside a tank with cracked hatches means a concussion with every shot. Casings from the submachine gun showered inside, ringing against the floor of the fighting compartment, burning necks and hands. Powder gases from their own weapons mixed with the smoke drifting in from outside. The crew coughed, eyes tearing, but continued to snap back with lead. Suddenly, the tank shuddered from a sharp, dry blow. It didn't feel like a high explosive. It was a pinpoint, drilling blow. German anti-tank gunners had brought up anti-tank rifles or hit with a shaped charge grenade. Ricochet. The projectile, fired at a tangent, didn't penetrate the turret's front plate, but spalled a piece of scale inside. A spray of sparks splashed into the gunner's face. But the worst happened to the loader. Into the gap of the cracked hatch, from where he was spraying the Germans with lead, flew a stray fragment, or a bullet, that ricocheted off the lid. The loader jerked, dropped the submachine gun. He didn't scream. He just slid down the turret wall, clutching his face with his hands. Through his fingers, black with oil, thick, dark blood spurted in pulses. "Wounded!" The gunner's wheeze cut through the ringing. "Pack it!" Gromov kicked the first aid kit toward the wounded man without stopping his observation. Pity and bandaging would come later. Right now, only fire. If the loader went out of action, the rate of fire would drop to 0. But right now the cannon was silent anyway. The targets were too close. Outside, a firestorm raged. The Germans, realizing they wouldn't take the crew alive, began methodically working over the tank with everything at hand. Bullets, shrapnel, rifle butts knocked on the armor. Someone tried to jam the turret with a crowbar. Someone poured combustible mixture onto the engine louvers. The temperature inside rose. The metal, cooled over the night, was heating up again. But now not from the motor's work, but from the friction of death against armor. "Faustpatrons!" the mechanic suddenly shouted, confusing terminology and panic upon seeing the characteristic flash of a handheld launcher or anti-tank rifle. A hit to the side. The armor wasn't pierced, but the inner lining cracked, showering shrapnel of bolts and rivets. The tank groaned with its whole body. It was the sound of a dying beast being torn apart. Gromov felt the space shrinking. The claustrophobia they had suppressed for a day crashed down with new force. The tank walls, previously seeming like protection, now pressed, squeezed, choked. The tank became a steel coffin that was being actively nailed shut. "Hold on!" yelled Gromov, reloading his pistol with shaking hands. "We won't die! Too early!" He understood. Their time was running out. Small arms ammo was low. 5 shells for the cannon, but nowhere to shoot them. The enemy was too close, in the dead zone. They were like a knight in heavy armor covered in rats. The only hope was that the hull would hold, and the Germans would get tired of pounding steel and pull back to call sappers with explosives. But the Germans were angry and stubborn. They wanted this tank, and they wanted this crew. Inside there was a smell of blood, burnt gunpowder, and animal terror. The loader wheezed on the floor, clamping the wound with a rag. The gunner stared blankly into the sight, which showed only brick dust. The mechanic gripped the levers of the dead engine, and Gromov, with a gray face, counted the cartridges in the last clip. 1, 2, 3, 7. 7 deaths he could still hand out before his own arrived. The bonfire of steel was flaring up, and they were burning in it alive, not yet knowing that the finale of this drama would be written not by German bullets. 5:30 in the morning. The sky over Stalingrad didn't just lighten, it tore open. First came a sound like the grinding of giant millstones crushing the sky. Then the air filled with a howl that vibrated even the fillings in teeth. It was the Guards' mortars working, BM-13. Katyushas. A volley of rockets passed over the factory roof, leaving smoky trails, and crashed down on the German rear. For Gromov's crew, this sound became a signal of a changing era. A second ago, they were doomed suicide bombers in a steel coffin being hammered from all sides. And now, the pressure outside vanished. The Germans besieging the tank scattered like cockroaches from light. They had a more serious problem than one immobile tank. A counterattack by the workers' and peasants' Red Army had begun. "They're running!" croaked the mechanic driver, looking into the vision block. "Fritzes are fleeing!" But there was no joy. There was only a new, even more terrible threat. Following the fiery wall of rocket artillery came Soviet infantry. Assault groups in gray greatcoats and padded jackets, angry, smoke-stained, charged to destroy everything wearing crosses on its armor. For them, this Panzer IV was simply a German firing point, an enemy, a target. Gromov saw through the optics as a trio of fighters in Kalkin Gol helmets approached the tank in dashes. One of them was unwinding the fuse of an anti-tank grenade on the run. Another held the mechanic's vision slit at gunpoint. They were coming to kill fascists. They were coming to kill Gromov and his men. "Don't shoot!" barked the sergeant major, intercepting the gunner's hand, who wanted to turn the turret out of inertia. "Don't touch the turret! Any movement with the barrel and they'll burn us!" It was an irony of fate worthy of a Greek tragedy. To survive in hell, under the Germans' noses, outsmart enemy intelligence, destroy staff officers, only to end up getting a grenade from their own brothers. The infantry didn't know about the trick. The infantry saw the silhouette of the enemy. The distance was closing. 30 meters. 20. The fighter with the grenade wound up for the throw. There was no time for regulation reports, no time to look for a white flag either. And there was nothing white in the tank anyway. All the rags had long become black from oil and soot. Gromov yanked the latches of the commander's hatch. The steel, seized from the heat of battle, yielded with difficulty. He struck with his shoulder, throwing the lid open. Fresh, frosty air hit his face, making his head spin, accustomed to carbon monoxide. The sergeant major leaned out of the hatch to his waist. In his hand, he clutched an oily rag. a dirty, stinking cloth used to wipe the breach. He waved it over his head like a banner of madness. "Friendlies, fucker! Don't throw!" Gromov's scream drowned out the noise of battle. It wasn't literary language. It was three-story, choice Russian profanity, into which the sergeant major put all the anger, all the fear, and all the hope of the last 24 hours. No German in the world, even knowing the language perfectly, could have imitated that intonation. In this scream was the very essence of Russian war, fury mixed with a plea. The infantryman with the grenade froze. His arm remained cocked back. He stumbled as if he ran into an invisible wall.
Halt!
Shouted the commander of the assault group.
Belay that!
The Soviet soldiers stopped 5 steps from the tracks. They looked at the turret of the German tank, from which a man was sticking out. But it was hard to call this creature a man. Gromov's face was a black mask of soot and oil. The whites of his eyes shone against this background with a mad fire. His tunic had turned into rags. "Fritz's?" asked a young fighter with a PPSH uncertainly, not lowering his barrel.
What the hell kind of Fritzes are you talking about?
Gromov spat black saliva onto the armor. 62nd Army, Tank Battalion. Help us get out, son. We have a 300, badly wounded. The infantry's shock was physically palpable. A sergeant walked up to the tank, carefully touched the armor, as if checking if it was a mirage. Russian Ivan in the German skin, he exhaled. You guys are something. We were about to write you off. Thought it was an ambush. The others began to climb out of the hatches. They climbed out slowly, clumsily, like worms from an apple. The mechanic driver fell to his knees right in the mud, greedily gulping air. The gunner helped pull out the wounded loader. He was unconscious, the rag bandage soaked in blood, but he was breathing. They looked like devils crawled out of the underworld. Black, dirty, terrifying. The contrast was striking. The infantry, having just entered the battle, was relatively clean, while these 4 looked like they wore all the dirt of Stalingrad on themselves. "Water," croaked the gunner. Someone held out a canteen. The tanker's hands shook so much the neck chattered against his teeth. Water spilled onto his chin, washing away layers of soot, leaving light tracks on black skin. "Who are you?" An infantry lieutenant approached the tank, examining the strange construction. He kicked the ventilation pipe torn off by the explosion lying nearby with his boot. "What is this circus?" "Camouflage," mumbled Gromov, sliding down the armor to the ground. His legs wouldn't hold him. The earth seemed soft as down. "You want to live, you'll twist yourself into worse shapes than that, Lieutenant." Fighters began to gather around. They looked at the trophy 4 with superstitious horror and respect. The German cross on the side was thickly smeared with mud, but still showed through. This machine was an enemy by birth, but became a Soviet soldier by fate. Gromov looked back at the tank. Now, in the morning light, he saw all its wounds. The armor was pitted with shrapnel, the side skirts hung by a thread, the pipe lay in the mud. But it stood, and they stood next to it. "Got documents?" the lieutenant asked more softly. "They don't ask for documents in a coffin," Gromov cut him off. "Contact the headquarters of the 113th. Tell them." Sergeant Major Gromov's crew made it out. On their own vehicle. Almost. Medics were already loading the loader onto a rain cape. Gromov took the remains of some shag tobacco from his pocket. His fingers wouldn't obey. The paper tore. The infantry sergeant silently handed him his ready-made rolled cigarette. The sergeant major took a drag. The acrid smoke hit his lungs, but after the carbon monoxide inside the tank, this smoke seemed like sweet nectar. "Alive," he said quietly, exhaling smoke into the gray sky. Identification error. You got lucky, brothers, that we know how to curse louder than you shoot. Salvation came not in the form of angels with trumpets, but in the form of angry men with grenades who simply heard their native swearing in time. War is chaos, in which life sometimes depends on a strong word spoken in time. The trophy Panzer remained right where it accepted its last battle. They didn't evacuate it. The logistics of war are a cynical and pragmatic thing. Dragging 25 tons of dead iron with a seized engine and a torn track under fire for the sake of repair made no sense. It was cheaper to capture a new one, or wait for the arrival of a train with Ural T-34s. The tank that pretended to be dead for a day to save the crew now died for real. It turned into real estate, into a landmark on the map for artillerymen, into a pile of metal gradually cooling in the autumn wind. The engineering construction of a rusty pipe and rags that saved 4 lives was scrapped before the dust settled after the battle. None of the trophy team who came later to strip the surviving armament even understood why the German gun barrel was so strangely stripped and the hatches wrapped in dirty rags. For them, it was just trash. The history of technical audacity was erased, leaving behind only lines in award sheets. Medals for Valor found the heroes 2 weeks later, in a damp dugout under the steep bank of the Volga. The wording in the orders was dry, clerical, devoid of the slightest hint of reality. For steadfastness and courage displayed in battles for the socialist motherland. Conducted battle in encirclement, inflicting significant damage on the enemy in manpower and equipment. Gromov held the heavy silver disc on a gray ribbon in his hands and read these lines. There was not a word about the ventilation pipe, not a word about lubricating the turret ring with waste oil, not a word about shooting under the noise and oxygen starvation. The bureaucratic machine of war didn't know how to describe cunning. It only knew how to describe heroism, or a tribunal. According to the documents, it appeared they simply sat heroically in the tank and shot. All that delicate work with sound, all that hellish psychology of playing dead, remained outside the brackets of history. It dissolved in the fuel oil, and blood soaked into the earth of the barricade factory. The loader survived, but didn't return to the front. He was discharged due to injury. The others dissolved into the millstones of the offensive, into the endless personnel lists of other battalions. The crew fell apart like a mechanism that had fulfilled its function. Years passed, decades. In one of the war museums, in the silence of an air-conditioned hall, stands a German T-4 tank. It is painted in perfect Panzergrau gray. Its tracks are blackened, and there isn't a scratch on the armor. The tour guide, a young girl with a ringing voice, tells schoolchildren about the armor thickness, gun caliber, and tactical technical characteristics. She talks about steel monsters and great battles. An elderly man in a jacket with ribbon bars stands to the side. Gromov looks at this museum exhibit and doesn't recognize it. This tank is a lie. It's too clean. It smells of paint and wax, not burnt flesh, wet rags, and fear. Museum silence is a dead silence. It has nothing in common with that ringing, vacuum silence of the neutral strip that bursts eardrums. He closes his eyes, and immediately the sterile hall disappears. The smell returns. The heavy, oily spirit of a cooling crankcase mixed with the metallic taste of blood in the mouth. The cold of oiled steel sucking the heat out of his back returns. The sound returns. The squeak of German boots on the armor overhead. Knock, knock, knock. Hans, got a light? A veteran's memory is not an archive with pretty pictures of attacks. It is a repository of sensory sensations that are impossible to get rid of. He remembers not heroic poses, but the trembling hands of the gunner
and how hard the turret handwheel turns without lubrication. He remembers how they turned into rats to become wolves. Real war is not when you run screaming "hurrah" at machine guns.
Real war is heavy, dirty, often humiliating work for survival. It is the art of turning disadvantages into advantages. It is the skill of using trash to kill an enemy armed with the latest technology. It is blind ballistics and the engineering audacity of the doomed. Gromov opens his eyes and turns toward the exit. He has nothing to do here, among polished mock-ups. His war remained there, in the ruins of 42, in a frozen box with a seized engine. The feat that no one learned about in detail remained only in their heads. But it is precisely this nameless, technical feat that is the true face of war. War is the art of cheating death. It is the skill to make the Reaper believe you are already dead so that he walks past, giving you a chance for just one precise shot. And even when you become just a line in an archive, this shot, taken from under a rusty pipe in time with someone else's explosion, will sound in eternity, louder than any parade march.